I want to give a great warm welcome to Everett Fritz, who will be our main speaker and presenter for today. Everett, as you've probably read in all my emails, is co-founder of Andrew's Ministries, where he's been working for 15 plus years. First, he started as a youth minister, but for the past 15 plus years working with parishes and schools, especially in coaching and consulting, to rethink how we do ministries, the youth ministry, the small group ministry. He has worked as the author of The Art of Forming Young Disciples, as well as his recent book of One Disciple at a Time. He has also spoken throughout the country, most recently at the National Institute, but also at NCYC, and has done work with Y Disciple Reform. He's a graduate of the Augustine Institute, is that correct? Where he has done his graduate work there. So without further ado, we're very grateful, Everett, for your time here, and please give Everett a warm round of applause. He leads us in our first session.
Appreciate it. Just so I know who I'm speaking with today, how many of you work with adults? Like adult ministry? Okay. It's like this side of the room, basically, in a couple of years. How many work with young people? How many are just here because you like coming to these things? All right. Yeah, just a handful. All right. Cool. So I work primarily with young people, and really I do ministry at this point in my life with people who work with young people. At least that's my primary apostle. One of the reasons I like working with young people is just because I think it's the most difficult mission field there is out there today. We are losing our young people left and right. And I'm a big advocate for, hey, the way we're doing ministry, we can't get stuck in our ways because the world has changed, and therefore the way in which we do ministry needs to change and adjust as well. But before I get into all of that, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. As David mentioned, my name is Everett Fritz. I'm from Denver, Colorado. I live there with my wife and 3 children. My son John Paul is 14 years old, my son Jude is 12, and my daughter Esme, who runs the house, is 9 years old. And Esme is a spitfire. And one of the things that I really appreciate about my daughter is that from a very young age, it was really easy to identify her love language. And if you're not familiar with the term love language, there was this popular book written several years ago about, it's called like the 5 love languages, and it talks about how people communicate love and receive love in different ways. And that it's important to identify people's love languages because you could have 2 spouses be married to one another, and one communicates love through acts of service and the other through quality time. And so the husband's doing the dishes thinking like, I'm loving on my wife, I'm taking care of the dishes, I'm mopping the floor up, and meanwhile she's thinking, why is he ignoring me? Like her love language is quality time. And so the 2 end up missing each other. And all of that to say that my daughter's love language was really easy to identify at a young age because it's gift giving. Like she loves to give gifts. And from a very young age, from the moment she could walk, I kid you not, on a near weekly basis, I would receive a gift from my daughter. And at least when she was like 3, 4, 5 years old, I'd come home and she'd run up to me and give me a big hug and say, Daddy, 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 I have a surprise for you. And I'd give her a hug and say, well, what's your surprise? And she'd pull me by my hand up the stairs to her bedroom, where inevitably what she had done is raided my closet and grabbed things that I already owned and wrapped them up so she could give them to me. And she would look with great anticipation to see what my reaction would be. And so I would say, oh, that's great. My shoes, thank you, honey. We learned pretty quickly we had to hide things that were important from Esme because our car keys would go missing, or my wallet, or things. And, a week later, she'd give it to me and say, yeah, thank you, I've been looking for that, So I actually have on my keychain, my wife got me as a gift, like an Apple, find your keys, basically. So I know that they're not taken by my daughter. But you can imagine if her love language is giving gifts, just how loved she feels when she receives a gift. So Christmas, we just had Christmas in our house is a big deal, at least for Esme. And at least from a young age, she would ask me on a near daily basis, how soon until Christmas or how soon until my birthday? And my father-in-law, one year, I think it was her 5th birthday, he decided to test whether or not it was the gift that she was excited about, meaning like what was inside the box, the toy, getting something new to play with, or if it was just the act of receiving a gift and unwrapping, like it wouldn't matter what it was that she received, if that would be sufficient. So he took all of her birthday gifts and he hid them in a closet and he grabbed a stick from the backyard on her 5th birthday, and he wrapped up the stick in a box. And on her birthday, we went over to the grandparents' house for birthday dinner, and sure enough, it came time to do gift giving, and he pulls out the stick in a box, and he gives it to her. She unwraps it, and she was so excited to receive this stick. And she went up to him and gave him a big hug, and she said, "Thank you so much for my birthday stick. Next year I would really like some toys." And so, we all laughed. We were like, "No, honey, it was just a joke. Here's your real gifts." And then we pulled them out. But sure enough, I realized, I took the stick and I went to throw it back in the backyard. And she looked at me and she said, "What are you doing with that?" And I said, "Well, honey, I'm throwing the stick." She said, "You can't throw that stick away. That's my birthday stick." And so I realized, I was like, we have to be careful what we give her, because that stick is now forever enshrined in her room as her birthday stick. I love this about my daughter because it's really easy, at least for me, to communicate the faith to her. Because the reality is, why do we do what we do in terms of working with adults, working with young people, just coming to these things to learn to become better ministers? Why do we do what we do? We do it because we know what we have received is important. What we have received is a gift from the Lord himself. That is the greatest gift we can receive, that it leads to eternal life. And we want to pass it on to other people. If you have been inspired by the Lord, you can't help but speak about that to other people. And we want to see fruit of our labor. We want to see that the work we do to raise up disciples is actually doing just that. And so the whole purpose of today is really to take a step back and say, what can we do to be more effective in passing this gift on to other people? Because what a shame it is for people to walk into our church, experience our liturgy, experience our communities, experience our worship, and then walk away and say, what I'm looking for is not here. And that's not what we want. And so if they come and they meet the Lord and they find something is lacking, then there's something that we have done that is ineffective. So all of that to say, we're going to start in prayer. I just want to pray that the Lord would open our hearts to receive whatever message he has, and ultimately just make us better tools for the purposes of building up his kingdom. So let's pray. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, as we enter into this day together, we pray that you would open our hearts to receive, that you would give a message, that your message would resonate loud and clear, and ultimately that you would drive us into action and inspire us to move into change and to be more effective. And ultimately, we simply want to be vessels at your disposal to pour out your love in the purpose of building up your kingdom. We ask all this through the intercession of Mary, and others will pray, Hail Mary, full of grace. The Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. One of my favorite stories that I can't help but tell, over and over and over again, is the story of Jan Terenowski. And I believe Jan Terenowski may have had one of the greatest impacts on the 20th century. Perhaps he might have been one of the most important people in terms of the impact that he had on the turnout of the 20th century and the future of our church. And most people, when I meet people, they have not heard the story of Jan Terenowski. His cause is currently being examined for sainthood right now, so he's a servant of God. But Jan Terenowski was a Polish tailor in the 1930s, 1940s, and he had a reputation of just being a holy man of God, one of those pious people that's in the pews, that prays on Sunday. He had a particular devotion to Mary and the Rosary, and he loved the spiritual classics, in particular St. John the Cross. And from a young age, he had fallen in love with the Lord. The Lord was doing things in his life. But so why did he become important? He was just a regular, any day, run-of-the-mill, holy, pious person. The Nazis invaded Poland in the 1930s, and one of the things that they were afraid of, and therefore tried to squash, were any kind of youth movements. Because they knew that if a revolution were to be raised up against them, it would likely come from the young people. That revolutions typically start with young people. That they tend to be the ones who have radical ideas. This is one of the reasons why they started Hitler youth camps, and young people were required required to participate in them, is Hitler was trying to start his own youth movement, start his own revolution, and squash any kind of rebellion that would raise up against him. So it became dangerous for youth ministries to exist in Catholic parishes, because as you can imagine, it would look suspicious. Now, the Catholic priests were the ones who would run youth ministries. And at least in a small parish in Wadowice, Poland, the Salesians who were running the ministry stopped doing it because just out of protection for themselves and for the young people they worked with. And Jan Ternowski saw this and said, well, we can't gather formally at the church, but he says, nothing can stop me from at least working with a handful of young men. And so he kind of handpicked 5 young adult men and would meet with them regularly at his home or for meals, and they would share life together, they would pray together, and he slowly, over the course of a period of time, poured into them. He won their hearts over, he mentored them in the faith, and in particular, he taught them what he knew and loved, which was loving Mary and the Rosary and the spiritual classics of St. John the Cross. And then eventually, he said to those 5 young men, hey, there is no one working with the high school boys. He says, Jesus had 12, I want each of you to have 12. So each of you grab 5 of the high school boys, and we'll take these boys out on camping trips out into the woods where it would be less dangerous because nobody would see that we were meeting, and these small groups would meet. And they would, the Ternowski would mentor the 5 young adult guys, the 5 young adult guys would mentor the 12 high school boys. And so 5 groups of 12, 60 altogether. They formed this group known as the Living Rosary. It became an informal youth ministry at the time. And of those 5 small groups of 12 young men, 60 altogether, 10 of them became Catholic priests, which is really remarkable. So you can imagine the ministry was pretty successful. But not only did 10 become Catholic priests, but one of them became Pope. Because one of the original 5 that Ternowski mentored was a young man by the name of Karol Wojtyla, who went on to become Pope St. John Paul II. And if you know anything about St. John Paul II, he changed the world. He was very responsible for the fall of the Soviet Union. His papacy of 20 plus years shaped really where our church is headed for decades and centuries to come. I mean, the influence of John Paul II on the world cannot be overstated. And it was interesting, one of the 5 young men who was mentored along with Wojtyla, who also became a priest, he said, and it's quoted in George Weidman's biography of Witness to Hope, he says that Ternowski's influence on Wojtyla was gigantic. I can safely say if it were not for Ternowski, neither myself nor Wojtyla would have become Catholic priests. And in fact, if you look at the papal mantra of Pope John Paul II, it was Totus Tuus Maria, which means Mary, I'm thine and all I have is thine. He learned to love Mary and the Rosary because of Ternowski. And if you look at his papacy, and in particular his witness, and what was very astounding about the way in which he lived his life is he became a witness to finding Christ within suffering. I mean, the suffering that John Paul II went through in his life was tremendous. It was, you read Witness to Hope, the book is this thick. It's like roughly 1,000 pages, and page after page of it talks about all the different things that he suffered through in his life, particularly early on. John the Cross is famous for writing The Dark Night of the Soul, which is a spiritual classic essentially about finding Christ within suffering. And so Ternowski formed a saint. In fact, John Paul II did his doctoral dissertation in theology on the spiritual classics of St. John the Cross, who he learned to love because of Ternowski. All Ternowski did to change the world was work with 5 young men. Like, he didn't run some big movement, some big program. He wasn't in a religious order. He was just a regular, normal, run-of-the-mill person with a job like you and me, who was a tailor, and he just happened to be holy and say, I can work with 5 young men. So, I love this story about Ternowski because it shows the influence of working small. That I have this theory that I call the theory of one. That one St. John Paul II has a greater impact in the world than 1,000 mediocre Catholics. And so our goal when we do ministry shouldn't be, hey, let's fill the church and fill it shouldn't be this kind of thing, basically. It shouldn't be, hey, let's fill a room and do a presentation and try to build big, huge programs. Because that, in and of itself, doesn't change the world. It's actually one-on-one work that has the greater impact in terms of building up the church. Like, in order to grow big, you have to think small. There is a gigantic conference that just let out earlier this week called the Seek Conference. Perhaps you've heard of it. It met in St. Louis this year. It usually meets every other year. It's put on by Focus, Fellowship of Catholic University Students. And they had 17,000 young people in St. Louis from January 2nd through the 6th this week. On fire for the faith. Best Catholic conference perhaps in the world in terms of what they do at the Seek Conference. And what's interesting is it was started by Focus, which is a ministry that was developed out of Denver, Colorado, started at one college campus with 3 missionaries. Like, it didn't start big. If I were to look at different movements in the church, Curcio, Charismatic Renewal, Neo-Catechumenal Way, Life Team, Focus, the one thing they all have in common is that they started with a handful of people. And in some cases, just like 2 or 3. Movements of the Holy Spirit start small. And so I have the whole idea of the theory of one is that the smaller we focus, the greater we build, and the bigger we build. And really, if you look at the way Jesus worked in his ministry, God had a plan to conquer the entire world. Christianity spread rapidly after Jesus' resurrection. I mean, over the course of roughly 500 years, Christianity essentially conquered the world, which is a really short period of time to conquer an entire world. They toppled the Roman Empire and took it over without ever being violent. I mean, it's really remarkable, the history of Christianity and how rapidly it spread. And it started with Jesus, one person. And if you look at the divine plan for how is God going to conquer the world, and he always had the intention to conquer the world. Frequently throughout the Gospels, he's preparing his apostles, saying to them, basically, you're going to go out to the Gentiles. This isn't staying in Jerusalem. Like, you're going to go out to the entire world and gather them back in. He was preparing them. But really, if you look at the divine plan, did he focus on the crowds? Yeah, he had a large group ministry, and I would argue, at the risk of being called a heretic, that his large group ministry was a huge failure. I mean, and the reason why I say this is he had crowds because he did miracles. Like, he had the reputation as a healer, so he had people following him. He had the reputation for multiplying, like changing water into wine, so people followed him. You know, it's like, hey, there's a free meal if we follow Jesus. But the crowds eventually turned on him. He frequently lost the crowds with his teaching. And eventually his teaching became so radical and against what was the common thought of the day that the crowds turned on him and had him killed. And because of that, I say his large group ministry was roughly pretty much a failure. The reason why his ministry persisted is because of the work he did with the 12. And even among the 12, he had 3, and even among 3, there was 1. Because if you look at the divine plan to conquer the world, Jesus looked out into the crowds and he singled out Simon the fisherman. And he looked at him and he said, rather than saying, how am I going to convert the entire world? He focused in on Simon the fisherman and he said, how do I make him Saint Peter? And then once he figured out how to change this common everyday fisherman from a common everyday fisherman to a great saint, he multiplied from 1 to 3, and then 3 to 12, and 12 to 72, and so on and so forth. Like, the divine plan was focused small to make the largest difference. There was a seminar I gave in Raleigh, North Carolina several years ago that became really the impetus for the book that's over there, One Disciple at a Time, where I was working with a bunch of catechetical leaders, giving a seminar much like this, and I started to challenge them because I could see when we were doing large group Q&A that they weren't getting the concepts that I was pushing. Because I said, look, like, it's really easy. In particular, I was working with an entire room of about 200 DREs, so Directors of Religious Education. And their questions kept being about how do they make their programs more effective. And I would just wanted them to get out of the program mindset. Because I said, look, like, I get it. I've worked in parish ministry for most of my life. It's really easy to get stuck in the weeds. Like right now, it's January, you just got back from the holidays. You're back in the mindset of programs start back up again, coming back from the holidays. We're leading into First Reconciliation season, Confirmation, First Communion. When that gets all said and done, you take a couple weeks off, and then you come back in July or August, and you recruit new catechists if you need them, and it's lather, rinse, and repeat. At no point do they actually take a step back and say, hey, is what we're doing working? Like, if the measure of success should be, are we making lifelong followers of Jesus Christ? And very seldom do I see parish ministries that are doing just that. In particular, catechetical ministries. So the ministries that we do with young people, for example, where we are doing classes and teaching them the faith and et cetera. Okay, well, where are all those young people who just received the sacrament of confirmation? They were just initiated into the mission of the church. We should be crawling with young people in our parishes if the programs that we're running are successful. If the programs that we're running are successful in terms of working with adults, we should have communities of people that love one another so that it's so common that a person walks into our church and sees the way. I mean, it used to be back in the time of the early church, it was said, some of the early church fathers said that people would come upon the Christian communities and they would be immediately converted because they would look at the witness of the people and say, look how they love one another in these Christian communities. They were attracted to the love that they had for one another. Heck, you look at Christian circles now, get on social media in terms of a Christian, Catholic Twitter drives me crazy. It's like the angriest bunch of people I've ever seen, and they're arguing about they're arguing about liturgy, they're arguing about bishops, they're arguing about, like, none of this makes any difference. Get off the computer, go make disciples. I've never met a single person that said, I was converted because of an angry conversation I had with somebody over Twitter. It's never happened. It's an entirely huge waste of time. So there's something to the witness of people. Like if the ministries that we were doing were effective in making lifelong followers of Jesus Christ, and people were being converted and living in communion the way the church is supposed to be, they should be able to walk into the doors of our church and immediately see something's different here. And that seldom is the case. So I was in North Carolina, and I was like, these people were asking me question after question after question about running effective programs. And I was like, oh, for crying out loud, in the back of my mind, I was like, none of your programs work. I just wanted to, but I was, if you want to lose your audience, just yell at them and say, none of your programs work. So I said, okay, just off the top of my head, I said, let's do a different exercise. And everybody stop what you're doing. We're actually going to do this exercise at the end of this presentation, even if it's just for a few minutes. But I said, I want you to imagine your pastor comes to you tomorrow, and everything you're doing in ministry today, whatever it is, your faith formation classes, your youth ministries, your RCIA, let's say for those who just like to come to things that you're involved in, whatever it is, whatever your ministry is no longer your responsibility. Your pastor says, I've got somebody else to do all the things you're doing, and they're actually going to do it better than you. So, and I only say that not because you're not important, but I just want this to be no longer a burden. You don't have to think about anything that you're currently doing in ministry. And he says, I have a new job description for you. And it's really important. So important, I'm going to double your salary. And then some of you are like, we're volunteers. Doubling my salary. I just wanted to communicate this has value for you. Like, this is so valuable and so important that he's putting everything he has behind it, and you no longer have to worry about anything other than this one job description. Your new job description is to make one saint. One lifelong follower of Jesus Christ in his church. One John Paul II. And you have 30 years, if you need it, to do it. And you can identify anybody that you want. somebody who's already well on their way, or somebody who's a total pagan. Just identify one and make that person your sole focus for the next 30 years. What would your ministry look like? And that was the exercise. I said, stop and think about it for a second. What would your ministry look like if you only had to focus on one person? And I had them take a step back and think about it. And what's interesting about the exercise is the whole purpose of it is to get you out of the program mindset, because now everything you're doing in ministry makes no, like the religious education class, you wouldn't put on a class for one person. You know, the big, huge event-based ministry, you wouldn't do that. The luncheons that the Altar and Rosary Society do, they wouldn't do that for one person. When you start to think about individuals, you start to think about what does this person need in their life? Ding, 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 ding. That's the first question we should be asking when we're putting together ministry. What is the need of the person that we're ministering to? I define ministry as simply meeting the needs of a person. And so I had them think through step by step. Here's the different things that make up a successful ministry. Anything from invitation to like what's the conversation look like, to where do you meet, to what are different kind of checkpoints or things that would have to happen in their life in order for them to get to a point of crossing thresholds of conversion. And when they started to think about that and write it down, I said, now take those steps you just identified, those different things that would have to be a part of a one-person ministry, and compare it to what you're doing in ministry today. And you're going to see where your holes are. Because if you have basically identified these are the things that we have to do in order to make a single disciple, we have to do these things. And you're not doing those things in your ministry, then what you found out what you're doing that's ineffective. You're missing these steps. And what was interesting is some people identify, they're like, literally nothing I'm doing in ministry lines up with what I just identified is important to make one lifelong follower of Jesus Christ. So, I scrapped the rest of the day and I said, let's start to talk about what these things are and how you can actually do them in your ministry. That was the impetus for the book that's over there. It's $10 if you want it. There's a plug for David. There you go. Buy the book. But I basically, that was the theory behind the book. Is I said, well, how would I answer this question? Like, what would I do? What would need to happen in order for me to make one lifelong follower of Jesus Christ? And I go chapter by chapter through the different things that I think are necessary. I'll identify a few of the steps for you, for our purposes. The invitation, like simple first step. How would you invite a single person? Because frequently, when we are starting a new ministry or when you're running your ministry, what do we do to advertise the ministry? It goes in the church bulletin, right? Maybe if you're lucky, you get a pulpit announcement. If you're really, really lucky, you get Father to talk about it. But you know what all those things have in common? They're entirely impersonal. Like, we think that because we put it in the bulletin or it went up on social media or it's on the website, that because it's there, we have done the work of inviting everyone. Because if you had a bulletin, you're invited to it. And the reality is, like, that's the same as if you went up to a tall skyscraper and you got up to the top floor of the skyscraper and you went outside and you had a stack of flyers and you threw those flyers up into the air and they landed somewhere down at the bottom, hundreds of flyers. That's basically what putting something in the bulletin looks like. Like, maybe somebody comes across the flyer and actually reads it and then says, hey, I should go to this. But more times than not, there's nothing more important. Like, if you were going to advertise a ministry, and I said, okay, here's your advertising technique. Go to the top of the skyscraper and randomly throw out flyers and hope they land in the right place. Somebody would say, you're an idiot. Like, that makes no sense whatsoever. The reality is, if you look at the way Jesus built ministry, what does he do? He personally invites. And if you were focused on one person only, you would be insane to advertise what you want to do with that one person as a bulletin announcement. Like, in all likelihood, your invitation becomes personal. Now, look, I live in Denver, Colorado, and we have more Catholic ministries in Denver than I think probably anywhere in the world. Focus headquarters are there, the Augustine Institute's there, Endow headquarters are there. Obviously, you've got the Catholic Charities, the Arch. I mean, I could go down a long list of different ministries there. Like Denver's a little bit of a Catholic mecca. And as a result, we have a lot of Catholic-owned families as well. Like, the parishes are relatively full. Now, I have 2 degrees in theology. I speak all over the country. I'm an author. I run my own apostolate as well. Do you know how many times in my parish I have been personally invited to do something in my parish? Like, I have been sought out and asked, will you do something in our parish? In terms of giving a talk, sweeping a broom, whatever the case may be. In 11 years living in Denver, do you know how many times I've been asked to do something? 0. Never. Now, you might say, well, why didn't you go forward? I have taken our like lay ministers out. I've met with my pastor. I've gone to my chancery and said, hey, here's what my gifts and talents are. I'm willing to serve. I'm interested in serving. Do you know how many times I've been followed up with on those conversations? 0. And you might be saying, well, what's wrong? Like, do you really make people upset when you meet with them? Like, maybe there's something wrong with me. Maybe that is true. Maybe there is something wrong with me. But more times than not, I mentioned it's like a Catholic mecca. We have capable Catholic people all over the place. And in my men's group, I would say, I think none of them are currently serving in their parishes in any capacity. Like, it's a common problem. And it's not just me. I had coffee with, oh gosh, he's going to kill me for name dropping him, but he won't find out, he won't tell him. Chris Stefanik I had coffee with, he lives in Denver, famous Catholic evangelist. Do you know how often he gets asked to do something in Denver? Seldom. Like, he said, very, very infrequently does he get asked. He says, it drives me crazy. He says, I'm all over the world doing ministry, and in my own hometown, I don't get asked to do things. There is a problem with a lack of personal invitation. If it's in the bulletin, that's not a personal invite. I have 3 kids, and in particular when they were young, I would be wrestling with them, and there would be some person who would get up at the pulpit, and they would give an announcement about some new ministry. It went in one ear, out the other. You know, it was not on my radar. I couldn't tell you what it was that they invited people to. Unless I perhaps talk to them after Mass, but for the most part, like, it's not an effective way to invite. When you meet with somebody one-on-one, it communicates to them, you are important. I have identified there are gifts and talents that the Lord has given you that I see in you that need to be raised up. That no one can do the ministry that we need done unless it's you. No one, you are important to our community. You're not falling through the cracks. A personal invitation goes a long way. Even in raising money, if you meet with a development director, they will tell you, if they do a letter writing campaign asking for money, for whatever cause it is that they're raising money for, they get a less than 1% return on that letter. So the only way they get a huge return on letter writing campaigns, you know, the kinds of things you get in your mail, is if they send out hundreds of thousands of letters. If they do a phone call, they say, or a group invite, where they meet with a group of people and they ask them to give money, there's a 17% return on investment. So 17% of them will give. But if they do a one-to-one ask, meaning that they meet with a person one-on-one, pitch the mission to them, of what it is that they're raising money for, 50% of the time the person they meet with will give. I find the same thing in ministry, that I will frequently meet with people who work in ministry that lament parents not being engaged in ministry. And they will say something like, the parents, they just drop their kids off, they don't go to church, they're just bringing their kids to get the sacraments and then they're gone, this is not important to them. And I said, well, how do you know it's not important to them? They said, well, they just drop them off. And I said, well, why is it that they're dropping their kids off at church and not attending themselves? And I get people giving me assumptions, and they're just assuming they know what the answer is. I said, have you asked them? And they said, well, no. I said, well, next time a parent drops the kid off, before the parent pulls away, say to them, hey, I want to go out to coffee with you. And then when they're out to coffee, ask them, hey, how come I don't see you at church? I've done that. Do you know what I found out? Frequently the parents will say to me, I'm caring for someone who is sick or ill, that's why I'm not at Mass. I'm a single parent, and I'm working a job. I've been wounded by the church in my experience. I assumed it was because the faith wasn't important to them. And when I actually met with them, I found they were wounded individuals, they were people who needed to be loved, they were people who needed to be supported. My assumptions went out the door. I wouldn't have known that if I hadn't met with them one-on-one. So all of this to say is even just the first step of, if you were working with somebody one-on-one, your invite would look entirely different. It would be personalized if you only had to focus on one person. It's one example of how things look different when you're focusing on one. Another thing that I think is essential in formation is experience and witness. What do I mean by those two words? Experience and witness. If you look at the way Jesus worked with his apostles, it's different, and he forms them differently than he does when he's speaking to a large crowd. When he's speaking to a large crowd, he gives amazing presentations, very challenging to the point where sometimes the crowds turn on him. But he was a teacher, he was a rabbi, he spoke in parables, he gave interesting teachings. With the apostles, he does something different with them. In fact, he frequently withholds information from them. He leaves them in the dark, frequently. For example, the bread of life discourse, that's where he famously talks about, in John chapter 6, you must eat my flesh and drink my blood, and he loses the crowd. The crowd is like, this guy is insane. He's saying we have to eat him. And then he turns to the 12, and he says to them, are you going to leave me too? And they say, Master, and Peter is the one who says, Master, where will we go? To whom shall we go? But it doesn't say in John chapter 6 that Jesus then says to them, okay, let me explain what I really meant by this. Like, there's going to be this thing called the Eucharist. I'm going to give you my body in the form of bread and wine, and it's going to become the Mass after I die. He doesn't. He leaves them in the dark until years later when he institutes the Last Supper and he connects the dot for them. And then, sure enough, after the resurrection, how did they know him? Well, in the story of Emmaus, they knew him in the breaking of the bread. There was a shared experience there. There is a moment, the first time he meets the apostles, at least Peter, James, John, and Andrew, they're fishing. And he does the fishing miracle with them, where, like, it says that they fished all night and they caught nothing, which means, FYI, they were terrible fishermen. At no time in the gospel does it say that they ever catch a fish unless Jesus is with them. So they're terrible fishermen. They fished all night, caught nothing, and then he says to them, throw the net over, and they pull in the catch of a lifetime. And then he does this miracle with them again after he rises from the dead. There's a moment where literally they fish all night and they catch nothing. He had died and risen from the dead. He shouts to them from the shore, throw your nets over, and they repeat the experience that they had with him before. And Peter immediately shouts, it's the Lord. Like he knew, because of this shared experience that they had together, who it was that was shouting from the shore. And he jumps into the water, and then it says that they ate the fish, and he started to teach them and explain things to them. That's when he starts connecting the dots. It's actually post-resurrection. It's interesting. He very purposefully withholds information from them so as to allow them to journey and experience the faith. And so frequently, when I meet with people, and they're working with somebody or working in the ministry, I'm like, look, what shared experiences of the faith have you had together? Do you go and do you pray together? Do you go on retreats together? On conferences, on whatever the case may be? Do you share life together and share experiences together? Because it's not enough for us to teach someone the faith, they have to see it lived in order for it to make sense. Like the other big thing it was literally the way in which the gospel spread so rapidly, is that everywhere the apostles went, they gave witness to what they had experienced. They started and led with that before they got into any teaching. And they lived in it when they would go and establish a new church, for example, in Ephesus or Corinth or Rome, they would live there for years. So that it wasn't enough for the apostles to go in and teach in the synagogue. No, they gave witness to what they had seen themselves, what they had experienced with Jesus, and then they lived there for a period of time so that the new Christian community could learn from their very way of life, which is really important because the apostles lived with Jesus for 3 years, and they learned their way of life from God himself. And so the new Christian community learned from their witness as well. They learned how God lived and lived accordingly because of that. It is not enough for us to teach people the faith. I could go on and on this point. I'll say one more thing to it real quick. I will frequently give a presentation called Why Young People Are Leaving the Church. And I had an experience this past summer where I was giving that very presentation at a conference. And I put it out on social media, hey, I'll be at this conference this summer giving this presentation. Why are young people leaving the church? And I had the next day, I saw my Twitter blowing up with all kinds of comments, which is unusual. Like, I've got a following on Twitter, but I don't typically, on just a random, hey, come to my presentation, get like 500 comments on my Twitter presentation. And I was like, well, what happened? Well, it turns out an archbishop who has a big following retweeted it, and because of that, a lot more people than normal saw the presentation, and they thought that the term, why are young people leaving the church, was an invitation to comment on why they thought young people were leaving the church. And so my Twitter, and as mentioned, Catholic Twitter is just a bunch of angry people. My Twitter blew up with all kinds of people weighing in on why they thought young people were leaving the church. And so I actually started my presentation by saying, hey, just so you guys know, here's what Twitter is saying the answer to this question is. They say that the bishops are the problem. They say you people are the problem. They say young people are the problem. They say that none of them are getting taught the faith, that catechesis, if they just knew the faith. I mean, and I even read, in particular, some of them were ridiculously absurd ones to them. But more times than not, when I pose the question, why are young people leaving the faith, somebody has a knee-jerk reaction and say, they don't know the faith. We need better catechesis. There was a national dialogue that was done in the country, in our country, that a report came out on it, I think in 2019, so relatively recently. And this was a 3-year study that the USCCB did on why young people are leaving the church, essentially. And they did a dialogue with young people. They had over 10,000 conversations. And in particular, I honed in on one paragraph that I thought was really interesting. And it said, we were really surprised at young people's understanding of the faith. We found that they were better catechized than we thought they were. They could articulate, more times than not, Catholic teaching. They said whether they agreed with it or not was a different story. Many times they wouldn't agree with it, but they could tell us what it was that they were taught. They said, but every single young person said over and over again that they felt like there was more to be said about the teaching, that they wanted to dialogue with somebody about the teaching, and in particular, they wanted to see it lived. They were looking for, the young people actually articulated that they were looking for living witnesses of the faith. That they felt that those of us who were teaching weren't actually living what we were stating we were living. And so I was like, boy, that is, I was like, in a nutshell, that is a wonderful description of what I see is wrong with formation in the church, is that we need to give witness to what it is that we are teaching. They need to see it lived. It's not enough to talk about prayer, they need to see prayer. It's not enough to talk about virtue, they need to see virtue. It's not enough to talk about fellowship, they need to see it live together. And if you look at the way Jesus works with his apostles, he kind of leaves the teaching out of it at times so as to let them journey at their own pace and experience the faith, and he walked alongside of them as they were experiencing it. Shared experience, shared witness. Encounter. Again, like this is not an exhaustive list. But if I were working with one person, I would say it is absolutely vital at some point in working with this person that they have an encounter with Jesus Christ. That seems like a no-brainer, right? They should have an encounter with Jesus Christ. If you go to Jerusalem today and you were to go to the different sites and you went to the tomb where Jesus resurrected, do you know what you would find if you looked in the tomb? Nothing. It's empty. And the reason why it's empty is because our God is not dead. Our God is alive. And the funny thing is, with people who are alive, you can have a relationship with them. And that's like kind of foundational to Christianity, is that our God became man because he wanted to be intimate with us. He wanted to be engaged and involved in our lives. Like he loves you individually, each of you. And the whole purpose of prayer is not to enter into some sort of like self-centered meditation that brings you into, I don't know, whatever enlightenment garbage. You know, the whole purpose of prayer is to have an engagement and an encounter with another person in Jesus Christ. And so, like, at some point in someone's formation, they should encounter God. And the great thing about encounter is that that's something that God does himself. Look, there's all kinds of retreat experiences, conferences, parish missions, lots of things that are built for the purposes of helping somebody to encounter Jesus Christ. What's beautiful is when you work one-on-one with somebody, you find that those encounter moments can happen at random, everyday times in their life. So, you can bring somebody to a retreat, and very frequently, if you talk to somebody, hey, when was the first time you had an encounter with God in your life? They might speak about a retreat experience that they had. But there's no guarantee you bring somebody to a retreat and they have an encounter. In fact, my son, who's 14, I brought him to his first retreat last year, and he got actually really upset at the retreat because he said, I haven't had this, like, you talk about this thing called an encounter or this experience of God. He says, it didn't happen for me. And I was like, well, it doesn't have to, bud. Like, there's no guarantee that that's going to be the moment in your life that Jesus introduces himself to you. And I used that as an opportunity to catechize him on prayer, on perseverance, on continuing to invite the Lord in. And sure enough, a few months later, he had his first encounter in prayer with Jesus Christ. But there is a reality that encounter needs to be part of the formation with somebody. I had, just to give you an idea of like moments when it can happen in just one-on-one experiences. I had, I'll tell a few different stories here. I'll tell you the Megan and Tom story. Megan was a girl in my youth group. She was 15 years old. She had become on fire with her faith, and she has a heart for evangelization. And at 15, she wanted to spread the faith to her friends, in particular her friends who didn't know Christ and weren't Christian. But at 15, she knew she couldn't articulate the faith that well. She wasn't that confident doing it on her own. So what she did during that summer in particular, when she was really on fire, is she would invite a new friend to youth group each week. And almost always it was somebody who wasn't Catholic. And it became like the norm. Like, Megan's got a new friend at youth group this week. And one week, she brought Tom to youth group. And there was like a buzz within the group, like, Tom is here. Like, what's Tom doing here? And so I pulled a couple kids aside. I was like, why is everybody talking about Tom? And they said, well, it's like Megan brought Tom here. And I was like, yeah, she brings a new friend every week. Like, it's not that unusual. They said, no, Tom is an atheist. And I was like, well, that's not unusual. Like, atheists have walked in the doors of churches before. They said, no. Tom is one of those, like, really angry atheists, like the kind that call all Christians stupid, and he lets you know about it, and he thinks religion is awful, and it's just like brainwashing, and it's like a cult, and he's like one of those atheists. And I said, oh, well, that is kind of interesting. So what's Tom doing here? They said, he's got a crush on Megan. And I was like, all right. Good call. Good job, Megan. And so, sure enough, Tom, like, we were doing theology of the body, and I was doing just like a generic study program for 8 weeks on theology of the body with my teens, and I was like, well, sure enough, like we're going to lead with church sexual teaching here. This will scare him away. But next week he was back, and the following week he was back after that. And sure enough, he went through the entire summer, coming back every week. And I was just doing just a generic general program. And at the end of the program, Tom pulls me aside and he said, hey, how do I become Catholic? And I was like, whoa, let's slow down here, Tom. Like, I know you like Megan, but like you don't need to become Catholic to impress a girl. Like, let's evaluate your reasons here. He says, no. He says, it's not that. He says, I've realized over the course of the summer that everything you're saying is true, that I've been entirely wrong about this religion thing. And he says, I need to go all in on this. And I was like, oh, wow. God's really doing something in your life. So we put him in RCIA, and I still kind of doubted. I was like, at some point, we're going to scare this kid away. Like, I was like, you know, let's be careful here. He's fragile in terms of his walk. But sure enough, he became, like, he was at youth group every week. He was at Mass every weekend. He was at RCIA every week. He was all in. And on a retreat, something came out. So he went with us on our fall high school retreat. And something came out in his small group on that weekend. And he really told his story for the first time. And what had happened is he was really angry. We knew that. And he had gotten to a point in his life where he knew something was missing and he couldn't identify what it was. And really he had developed some sort of complex where he felt like he was not loved. And because of that, he just had become extremely depressed. And to the point where he had decided one evening that he was going to take his life. And he wrote a suicide note to his parents, and he put it on his bed, and he got in his car, and he drove to the high school, where the bleachers, which sat up really high, his plan was to climb up to the top of the bleachers and throw himself over the top to his death. And he walked up to the top of the bleachers, and for whatever reason, he said he took out his phone and he put it on the bleachers. And he got up to the top, and right as he was about to jump and take the leap, his phone buzzed, and on a metal bleacher, that causes a very loud sound. And it resonated, and it just got his attention. And he looked down at the phone, and he picked it up, and it was Megan calling. And he picked it up, and he said, hello. And Megan said, hey, Tom, I just wanted to know if you would come to youth group with me tomorrow. And he said, okay. And he hung up the phone, and he got down off the bleachers, he went back in his car and went home. And the next day was the day that I met Tom for the first time. See, I didn't do anything. I showed up and gave, like, the program that I had planned for that week. Megan did the same thing she had been doing, which was inviting. I mean, that's heroic in and of itself. But literally, God used just the simple yeses that we gave to him in our lives to do a profound encounter for Tom in that moment. Tom, to this day, he's now married with 3 children. He's a Catholic youth minister, daily mass goer, works for the church, is on fire with his faith. I mean, it's really remarkable what the Lord did in his life. But this encounter that he had with him was just in a day in, day out experience of, you know, there was something going on with him that I was not aware of when I met him. He had his own story, and he had an encounter with Christ because of it. So, you know, when you're working one-on-one, you get privy to the individual things that God is doing with somebody in their life. And because you give them their attention, you get the privilege of walking with them and seeing what God is doing in their life. Like the final thing I'll say, and I can, you know, I don't think that these are all the steps, but the last thing I would say that is really important is if I were doing one-to-one ministry with somebody, there would be discipleship happening. And what discipleship is it's a hot buzzword in the church right now. Like you see discipleship on all kinds of advertising materials. Best resource and program for discipleship. Use our program and you'll be doing discipleship. Discipleship is not a program. If you ever see a resource that says to you, run our program and you will, to start discipleship in your parish, they don't understand what discipleship is. The whole purpose of discipleship is to not be a program. Like at the time of Jesus, what discipleship was is that a rabbi would come in and he would evaluate a class as it was graduating. And he would go up to each young man in the class, and he would only select the best of the best. And he would say one of two things to each of the students. He would say either go and learn the trade of your father, or he would say come and follow me. And if he said come and follow me, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. Because you got the opportunity to live with the rabbi as his disciple and learn from his very way of life. The whole point of discipleship was that it was an apprenticeship in what it was that a rabbi was doing. Otherwise, you were stuck doing the trade of your father, which, if you look at Jesus and you ever wondered, hey, why did they drop their nets and leave their father on the boat and leave everything behind when they heard the words, come and follow me? It's because when Jesus comes upon them, they're doing the trade of their father. They were not the best of the best. They were not the brightest. Their opportunity had come and gone, and the words, come and follow me, was a second chance, a second opportunity. And so that's why they dropped their nets and left it all behind. And they learned from Jesus' very way of life. I had this moment in prayer one day where I was reading the description of John's description of the resurrection. And in his story, it says that Peter gets to the tomb and he looks inside. Peter and John, they look inside. And John goes into description about how the burial cloths were folded and how the headcloth was in a different location, folded somewhere else. And I just keyed in on that for a moment, and I was like, well, that's kind of odd. Why did he take a couple of lines of his story, description of the gospel, of this depiction, and go into detail about how the clothes were folded? And it occurred to me, because the lines that followed that were, they saw and they believed. And it occurred to me that they didn't understand yet the resurrection. Because after that, there are lots of moments of doubt, of trying to figure out what's going on. So I was like, okay, well, it's just said they saw and believed, but now the next chapter, they're still trying to figure things out. But it just said they saw and believed. And I said, so what was it that they believed? And the Lord said to me in prayer, go back to the burial cloths. And I was like, oh, okay. And so I started praying with that line, like about the folding of the burial cloths, and I realized, oh, they knew that he was alive. They didn't know how. They didn't know why. It didn't make sense to them yet. But the reason why they knew he was alive is because they looked in the corner and they saw the headpiece and how it was folded and in a different location. And at least in prayer, what the Lord said to me, it was that, he says, you know how they knew that I was alive? Because they knew how I folded my clothes. And because they knew how I folded my clothes, they knew how I folded my clothes because they lived with me for 3 years. And because they knew the way in which I folded my clothes, they knew I was alive. It didn't make sense to them how I was alive yet. I had to explain that to them later. But they knew I was alive because of the way I had lived my life. Like, that's what you learn from the rabbi. They got to learn how God himself folded his clothes in the morning, how he brushed his teeth, what his prayer routine was, how he shared, dealt with difficult people and difficult situations, how he told a joke. None of that's in the gospel. They don't take time in the gospel to tell you, here's how God himself brushed his teeth. You know, you only get that kind of good stuff by learning the very way of life of God, by actually seeing his witness and his experience. That's what Christian life is supposed to be. It's not supposed to be a class. It's supposed to be an immersive experience. That's how you make disciples. That's how you change lives. That's how you build community. That's how things spread rapidly, is an immersive experience. So, all of this to say, look, your pastor is probably not going to come to you tomorrow and say, here, like, your new job description is make one disciple. That's not realistic. But if we get into that mindset of how do we make one, that's how you actually change a community, change the world. If you want to do parish renewal, you start focusing small. If you want to say, how do we start and change the lives of our young people, change the lives of our ministry, do pro-life ministry, get new people involved, build a big gigantic thing, you focus small. And you start to focus in on an immersive experience of working with people individually, meeting their needs, and just being patient with them and walking with them through their life. And you'd be amazed at how quickly that multiplies. We're going to talk about how you multiply that this afternoon and a little bit about the practicals. But from here, let's see where we're at in time. Oh, I've been talking a while. From here, what we're going to do is you're at tables, which is great. I want you to take the next 10 minutes or so and ponder and think about the question and maybe write a couple things down. If your responsibility was only to make one lifelong follower of Jesus Christ, what's something that would be that would be absolutely necessary to that ministry? Like, what would ministry look like? What are the things you would identify? This needs to be a part of the way in which we make one disciple. And so I want each person to think about that individually for 10 minutes, and then we're going to have a table discussion and have people share with each other, and you guys kind of come up with a list. Then we'll do some large group processing.